At 35, nobody listens when he speaks. At 19, approval mattered more than self-respect. At 35, conversations keep cutting him off. At 19, he never learned to speak up. At 35, exclusion feels familiar now. At 19, disrespect was tolerated just to belong. At 35, workplace tension drains his confidence. At 19, confrontation felt too uncomfortable. At 35, his voice carries little weight. At 19, apologizing became a habit. At 35, stronger personalities dominate every room. At 19, boundaries were never built properly. At 35, people-pleasing becomes emotionally exhausting. At 19, acceptance mattered more than dignity. At 35, public disrespect feels normal now. At 19, he laughed when others crossed the line. At 35, leadership opportunities pass him by. At 19, discipline and responsibility were avoided. At 35, frustration grows quietly inside him. At 19, people were allowed to cross every limit. At 35, manipulation keeps repeating itself. At 19, the warning signs were ignored early. At 35, discomfort shows in his body language. At 19, saying no felt impossible. At 35, low confidence becomes visible. At 19, comparison slowly destroyed self-worth. At 35, relationships feel emotionally draining. At 19, loneliness made disrespect feel acceptable. At 35, even coworkers treat him dismissively. At 19, confidence was never built through effort. At 35, self-respect feels unfamiliar now. At 19, difficult conversations were always avoided. At 35, numbness replaces emotion. At 19, popularity mattered more than standards. At 35, regret follows years of silence. At 19, respect was lost one moment at a time. At 35, people underestimate him constantly. At 19, attention mattered more than value. At 35, confidence feels broken internally. At 19, fear and avoidance shaped his habits. At 35, emotional exhaustion becomes permanent. At 19, assertiveness was never learned. At 35, he feels invisible around others. At 19, access was given without boundaries. At 35, respect feels difficult to earn back. At 19, self-development was ignored too long.
If this video opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe, because what you learn today can save your future tomorrow.